Singapore is smaller than New York City, yet it's richer than almost every country in the world. In just a few decades, it went from slums and poverty to gleaming skyscrapers, financial hubs, and the highest standards of living in Asia. But how did this tiny island pull off one of the most shocking economic transformations in history? Let's dig into the story. From struggle to strategy. When Singapore became independent in 1965, it didn't look like a country destined for wealth. The island had no natural resources, high unemployment and political tensions that even led Malaysia to kick it out of the Federation. On paper, Singapore was in trouble. But the country had one powerful asset, its first Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew. Lee understood that without oil, gold or fertile land, Singapore's only chance was to use its brains and its location. Sitting at the crossroads of the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea and the Strait of Malacca, Singapore was perfectly placed to become a shipping and trading hub. Lee knew that if he could build stability and trust, foreign companies would come. So, the government focused on building a clean and efficient legal system, cracking down on corruption and creating reliable infrastructure. In the early years, manufacturing was the key. Singapore encouraged labour-intensive industries like textiles and electronics assembly to solve unemployment. But Lee always saw this as a stepping stone, not the end goal. He wanted to move Singapore up the economic ladder toward advanced industries and finance. What mattered most in those early days was setting the foundation: stable government, rule of law, public housing, and world-class health and transport systems. One of Singapore's first big moves after independence was tackling housing. In the 1960s, much of the island was covered in slums without proper sanitation. The government passed the Land Acquisition Act, giving it the power to buy land cheaply. Instead of leaving people in poverty, the land was used to build new public housing through the Housing and Development Board. This wasn't just about giving people homes, it was about giving them a stake in the country's success. Today, around 80% of Singapore's population lives in public housing, but these aren't grim, concrete blocks. Citizens are able to buy their homes at subsidised rates, meaning ordinary people get to build wealth through property ownership. To keep things stable in such a multicultural society, the government even enforces racial quotas in housing estates, ensuring neighbourhoods are mixed and avoiding ethnic ghettos. To help people afford homes and secure their future, Singapore created the Central Provident Fund. This is a mandatory savings scheme where workers and employers both contribute a significant portion of wages into personal accounts. The savings can be used not just for housing, but also for retirement, healthcare, and even education. With interest rates around 5%, the fund created one of the highest saving rates in the world and gave Singaporeans a safety net while fueling the country's economic growth. Good governance mattered more in Singapore than almost anywhere else. Unlike neighbours blessed with oil or minerals, Singapore had to attract foreign investment to survive. That meant creating one of the easiest places in the world to do business. The government worked hard to keep regulations transparent, corruption low, and infrastructure reliable. Multinational corporations poured in. At first, they came for cheap labour, but Singapore pushed to make sure foreign companies didn't just exploit workers and leave. The government invested in technical schools, training programs, and partnerships with companies to upskill the workforce. By the 1990s, Singapore had moved beyond textiles into high-tech industries like semiconductors, aerospace, and biotech. Even today, manufacturing makes up more than 20% of Singapore's economy, with semiconductors as its largest export. To keep wages competitive, the government established the National Wage Council in 1972. This body balanced the interests of businesses, workers, and the state, making sure pay rose in line with productivity. That way, Singapore's exports stayed competitive, while workers still benefited from rising prosperity. By the 1980s, Lee Kuan Yew was preparing Singapore for its next transformation. He looked at financial hubs like New York and London and saw an opportunity. Singapore liberalised its financial system with lighter regulations and low taxes, turning the city into a magnet for banks and investment firms. Today, more than 4,200 multinational companies base their regional headquarters in Singapore. Corporate tax rates are just 17%, sometimes even lower, and that's been a huge attraction. By the 2000s, Singapore had fully embraced a knowledge-based economy, encouraging innovation, startups, and entrepreneurs. Lee's successors continued this strategy. Goh Chok Tong emphasized attracting big business. Later, Lee Hsien Loong, Lee Kuan Yew's son, focused on making Singapore not just a place to work, but also a place to live. He knew that to keep global talent and wealth flowing, Singapore needed to be attractive beyond the boardroom. That meant investing in entertainment, leisure, and lifestyle. Singapore didn't just want to be a financial hub, it wanted to be a destination. In the 1970s, the government began ambitious land reclamation projects, literally expanding the size of the island. The reclaimed land became home not just to offices and housing, but also to luxury attractions. One of the biggest moves was bringing Formula One to Singapore. Hosting the world's first F1 night race cemented its status as a glamorous global city. Another was allowing casinos, called integrated resorts. These weren't just gambling halls, but massive entertainment complexes with hotels, theatres, and shopping malls. The timing was perfect. As China and India's economies boomed, wealthy tourists and investors from across Asia flocked to Singapore. They came to gamble, shop, and party, but also to park their fortunes in the country's stable financial system. The results were staggering. Assets under management in Singapore grew from $420 billion in the early 2000s to $3.6 trillion by 2022. Geography has always been Singapore's secret weapon. Its position at the crossroads of Asia makes it an ideal hub for trade, travel, and logistics. The Port of Singapore is the second largest in the world by volume and the largest for transshipment, where cargo is transferred from one ship to another on the way to its final destination. Changi Airport plays the same role in the skies, acting as a connecting point for flights across Asia and beyond. These hubs create powerful network effects. Because so many ships and planes already pass through, it attracts even more. This cycle makes Singapore indispensable for global trade. Surprisingly, one of the country's biggest exports is refined petroleum. Despite having no oil of its own, Singapore built one of the world's largest refining industries, importing crude and exporting finished fuel. This once again shows how Singapore has mastered the role of a regional service provider, turning location into wealth. The money earned from trade and exports wasn't just spent, it was invested. Singapore became one of the first countries to create sovereign wealth funds, and today it has two of the largest in the world, Temasek Holdings and GIC. Together, they manage close to $1 trillion. These funds invest in companies, infrastructure, and global assets, ensuring that Singapore's wealth keeps growing. For all its success, Singapore hasn't escaped challenges. On paper, the average citizen is among the richest in the world, but beneath the numbers lies a story of inequality. The gap between the richest and the rest is visible, especially when you walk through neighbourhoods that contrast glittering high-rises with more modest public housing blocks. The government measures income inequality using what's called the Gini coefficient. Before taxes and subsidies, Singapore's number is high, showing a wide wealth gap. But after progressive taxes and transfers, it improves significantly. The government works hard to redistribute wealth, but many citizens still feel the cost of living rising faster than their wages. One example is cars. Owning a car in Singapore is famously expensive, more than anywhere else in the world. That's because of strict policies designed to limit congestion and pollution. Instead, the government promotes one of the most efficient public transport systems on the planet. For housing, public apartments are subsidised, but private property prices are some of the highest in the world, making home ownership increasingly difficult for younger generations. Another point of criticism is political freedom. Since independence, Singapore has been ruled by the same party, the People's Action Party. Lee Kuan Yew believed stability was non-negotiable, and he famously argued that freedoms like press and protest had to be subordinated to the needs of the nation. Over the years, critics have described Singapore as having a climate of fear, where open dissent was discouraged. Even today, protests are tightly restricted and the country ranks low in global press freedom indexes. Yet for many Singaporeans, the trade-off has been acceptable. The government delivers clean streets, low corruption, and a safe society, and support for the ruling party has remained strong for decades. Still, the political landscape is shifting. Younger citizens are more vocal, more diverse, and more willing to demand openness. As the country grows wealthier, expectations for freedom and participation are rising. How Singapore manages this shift will shape its future as much as its economic strategy. After Lee Kuan Yew stepped down, his successors, Goh Chok Tong and Lee Hsien Loong, kept the engine running. Under Lee Hsien Loong, Singapore not only deepened its role in finance, but also made itself a place where global talent wanted to live. That meant luxury housing, top universities, world-class healthcare, and lifestyle attractions that made the city a magnet for expats. But nothing lasts forever. In 2024, Singapore began its first leadership transition in 2 decades. Lawrence Wong, who grew up in public housing and won praise for his handling of the COVID-19 crisis, became Prime Minister. Unlike his predecessors, Wong is seen as having a more down-to-earth, approachable style. His challenge is clear: keep Singapore competitive in a world where other nations are learning from its playbook. Wong faces new pressures. Housing prices are high, the cost of living is rising. The population is aging rapidly, putting pressure on pensions and healthcare. And there are concerns among citizens that foreign workers are taking too many of the best jobs. While data shows inequality is falling, perception matters, and many Singaporeans feel left behind. Perhaps the biggest long-term challenge for Singapore is demographics. With one of the lowest birth rates in the world, the country struggles to replace its workforce naturally. Raising a family in Singapore is expensive, and many couples are having fewer children, or none at all. To fill the gap, Singapore relies heavily on migrant labour. Foreign workers are a backbone of industries from construction to tech. At the same time, this has created tension, with some citizens feeling that immigration is diluting opportunities. Balancing this inflow with social harmony will be critical for Singapore's stability. So how did Singapore get so insanely rich? It wasn't luck. It wasn't natural resources. It was a vision carried out with discipline and precision for decades. But the story isn't over. As leadership changes and new challenges emerge, the world will be watching to see if Singapore can continue its streak of success. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the rise of Singapore, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. We'll be bringing you more stories about the world's most fascinating places and the secrets behind their wealth.